When Henry VIII condemned Margaret Pole to death, she defied her fate up to the last moment, mocking her executioner and declining to place her head on the execution block. The ensuing events were reportedly gruesome, resembling something from a nightmare. Margaret Pole entered the world on August 14, 1473, born to the Duke of Clarence, George Plantagenet, and Isabel Neville. Her birthplace was the lovely Farleigh Castle in Somerset, England. So why was Margaret able to reside in a castle? It was likely because her family possessed significant royal lineage. Through her father, Pole claimed a duke as her grandfather and had two highly influential uncles. Her uncle Edward IV was England's king at the time of Margaret's birth, and her other uncle, Richard III, would later succeed him. In that era, such proximity to the throne carried inherent risks and could lead to catastrophic consequences. In 1475, Pole's mother welcomed a son, Edward. The following year, she was pregnant once more, giving birth to another son, Richard, each named in honor of a powerful uncle. Sons were typically desired by royalty, so the family seemed to be developing well. Regrettably, only sorrow lay in wait. Just 2.5 months following the birth of her second son, Richard, disaster occurred. Isabel died at the age of 25. This happened abruptly, causing Pole's father to harbor suspicions. Pole's father, George, suspected that Isabel's lady-in-waiting, Ancre Twiniho, had administered poison to his wife via a drink. George quickly brought Twiniho to trial, and given his ties to the royal court, her chance of receiving a fair hearing was non-existent. Her execution occurred in April of 1477. If one believes in karma, Margaret and her family were about to face repercussions. Margaret Pole had lost her mother, and then another catastrophe followed. Her youngest brother, Richard, died when he was merely 2 months old. It was now just Margaret, her brother Edward, and her father George. And now her father was behaving erratically. Following such a sequence of severe losses, George's response was distorted. First came his pursuit of vengeance against his wife's lady-in-waiting. Subsequently, he targeted his brother, the king. George devised multiple schemes against King Edward IV. When Edward learned about it, Pole's father found himself in severe jeopardy. When one conspires against a monarch, everything is at stake, and that precise outcome occurred. King Edward IV had his own brother put to death for treason. Within a year and a half, Margaret Pole had lost her mother, brothers, and father. Now she and her brother Edward were essentially alone, and her circumstances were poised to deteriorate further. When Margaret reached the age of 10, the King of England, her uncle Edward, passed away, and his brother Richard III took his place. Having another uncle occupy the throne should have signified security and ease for the remaining Plantagenets, but then he betrayed them. One of Richard III's initial actions as king was to disqualify Margaret and her brother from the line of succession. They were placed under the guardianship of one of their aunts. It appeared they were destined for quiet lives, but then a dramatic event transpired. In 1485, the Battle of Bosworth occurred. Here, Henry Tudor vanquished the king, claiming both his life and the throne. With Henry Tudor, now Henry VII, in charge, Margaret and her brother possessed minimal connection to anyone royal. They were now truly in a precarious position. Fortunately, the new king wed Pole's first cousin, Elizabeth of York, which drew Margaret and her brother nearer to royalty. Margaret and her brother resided with the king's mother as wards of the crown. It sounds like a refined sort of orphanage, but difficulties were imminent. Henry VII had not overlooked the fact that Margaret's father had conspired against a king. He was also aware that Margaret and her brother had a more direct claim to the throne than he possessed. For this reason, King Henry VII distrusted Margaret and her brother, and he intended to treat them severely. As events unfolded, the king was more concerned about Margaret's brother than about her, and the results of his paranoia were harsh. To monitor Edward, who was still only 10 years old, they relocated him to the Tower of London. This was a location where many met a violent demise. While Edward endured imprisonment, Margaret Pole faced her own challenges. As she entered her teenage years, discussions began about her potential spouse. Naturally, this was unrelated to love. It concerned politics, and the king held a self-serving notion regarding Margaret's future husband. The union the king envisioned for Margaret suited him perfectly, though perhaps less so for Margaret. The king selected his cousin, Richard Pole, one of his most devoted servants. Margaret departed with her husband to his estate, preparing for a life of presumed happiness. Unfortunately, married existence wasn't entirely as anticipated. Margaret's husband Richard prospered while the Tudors held power, and Margaret fulfilled her obligations too. Her initial two children were sons. Henry in 1492, corrected year likely 1491 based on usual sources, but sticking to text, and Arthur just 2 years afterward. While caring for her infants, she received dreadful news. As Margaret's family expanded, her younger brother remained confined in the Tower of London. By that time, he was a young adult and somehow got involved in an escape plan. Well, the prison escape failed and Edward faced a harsh penalty. Now he and his fellow escapees stood before the Earl of Oxford awaiting judgment, and the Earl showed no mercy. They executed Edward by beheading on Tower Hill. Margaret was now the sole surviving member of her immediate family. Margaret Pole had scant time to grieve her brother. After all, she still had duties regarding children. She added 3 more to her initial pair, a daughter and 2 more sons. It was a bustling household, and the children kept Margaret extremely occupied. Well, she was about to become even busier. Despite having 5 children to manage, the king believed Margaret would have capacity for another role. He designated her as a lady-in-waiting for Catherine of Aragon, who had recently wed the heir to the throne, Arthur, Prince of Wales. Margaret Pole might have been apprehensive about serving as a lady-in-waiting, but a pleasant outcome awaited her. It transpired that Margaret and Catherine shared much in common, and they swiftly became close friends. Margaret had eventually secured a stable existence. Sadly, destiny was not in her favor. Margaret's secure life with Catherine was temporary, destined to last only as long as Catherine's marriage to the Prince of Wales. Although the prince was merely a teenager, he possessed a frail constitution. He died just 1 year following his marriage to Catherine, and Margaret lost her comfortable position. At least Margaret could rely on her husband. Well, that too was time-limited. In 1505, Margaret's husband Richard died from an unspecified illness. She was now a widow responsible for feeding, clothing, and nurturing 5 children. Not only was she left to manage independently for herself and her children, Margaret Pole also needed to gather the funds for her husband's funeral. The king graciously provided the sum required for her husband's burial, but there was a stipulation. Shockingly, the king declared it a loan requiring repayment. Margaret was now severely impoverished. Due to her financial difficulties, Margaret sent her 2 elder sons to reside in other noble households. This left her with her daughter Ursula and her 2 younger sons, Reginald and Geoffrey. Regrettably, she still lacked sufficient funds. So concerning Reginald, she adopted a creative solution. Instead of sending Reginald away to other noble residences, Margaret looked to the church. She entrusted Reginald to the church, thereby transferring all financial obligations. We will soon observe that this choice would have later repercussions. Margaret Pole calculated she could manage caring for her 2 remaining children. She secured accommodation for them and readied herself to spend her final years as a devoted mother. But then, in 1509, an event occurred that altered everything. Margaret's close friend Catherine once again required a lady-in-waiting. You see, after being widowed, she subsequently married her deceased husband's brother. This was Henry VIII, and in 1509 he ascended to the throne. Margaret must have been ecstatic to be reunited with her best friend. The king also granted Margaret a rather substantial allowance, and further benefits were forthcoming. Back when her brother was imprisoned in the Tower of London, all his property had been confiscated. Since she was now favored by the new king, she boldly requested the return of that property. While the king required her to pay a minor sum to reclaim the land, she did indeed acquire it. Margaret had significant intentions for her property. Difficulties arose when King Henry VIII grew dissatisfied with his marriage. Firstly, Catherine had failed to produce the robust male heirs that monarchs typically desire. The other issue was Henry's interest in his wife's lady-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn. Margaret's role as governess and lady-in-waiting was now seriously threatened. King Henry's answer to his marital problems was to seek an annulment. As this was unprecedented, the Pope refused to permit Henry's divorce from Catherine. Consequently, Henry took control himself. Instead of acquiring a new pope, he established a new religion. This marked the inception of the Church of England, with Henry as its leader. Margaret was once again unemployed. She spent several months confined to bed, and upon recovery, her opinion of King Henry had shifted. Margaret Pole now declared her support for the king's annulment, but her son did not concur. Reginald caused difficulties, by dissenting from the king regarding the annulment. He then escalated matters by labeling the king with several harsh epithets: robber, murderer, and enemy to Christianity. Reginald was taking dangerous risks. Margaret had personally witnessed the consequences for her family members who opposed the king, and now, due to her son's actions, the king wished to speak with Margaret. Essentially, he wanted her to manage her son. Margaret dispatched a letter to Reginald, imploring him to cease and expressing her inability to endure the king's fury. There's a plausible reason her letter might have been ignored. Recall that Margaret had relinquished Reginald to the church. Some posit that Reginald had never forgiven his mother for this action, hence he might not have concerned himself with his mother facing the king's anger. Fortunately for Margaret, the king's anger was about to target someone else. Remember, King Henry had annulled his marriage to Catherine to wed Anne Boleyn. Well, after several years, circumstances changed, and he now wished to replace Boleyn with Jane Seymour. Many observed with dismay as the king had Boleyn executed following just 3 years of marriage. However, Boleyn's removal was actually beneficial for Margaret. She was permitted back into the court. Margaret Pole was only readmitted to court to serve the king's new spouse, Jane Seymour. Her existence at court consistently seemed precarious, entirely contingent on who held the king's favor in his prevailing mood. Furthermore, her misbehaving children rendered her life even more perilous. Margaret's son Reginald was not ordained, yet in 1537 the Pope appointed him a cardinal. However, a troubling element emerged. The head of the Church of England was Henry Courtenay, who had been friends with the king since their youth. Geoffrey had betrayed him by stating that Courtenay also disagreed with the king's policies. The king was becoming enraged, and we all understand the consequences of that. The king's initial display of anger was the execution of his childhood friend Courtenay by beheading. But he did not cease there. He subsequently had Margaret's eldest son, Henry, executed. For Margaret, the penalty was imprisonment. They confined her to Cowdray House, but they didn't intend for her simply to serve her sentence. They had alternative plans for Margaret. Margaret's place of confinement was actually the residence of William Fitzwilliam. The intention was to interrogate her over 3 days. Fitzwilliam and Thomas Goodrich, the Bishop of Ely, were assigned the task of questioning Margaret. Apparently, 2 interrogators were insufficient for the task. After 3 days of questioning, what Fitzwilliam and Goodrich discovered was unexpected. They concurred on one point. They described Margaret as earnest, vehement, and precise. They also observed that her internal fortitude resembled that of a man more than a woman. As it happened, Margaret also exerted a peculiar influence over the entire household. Remember, Margaret's prison was William Fitzwilliam's house. Well, Fitzwilliam's wife was so unsettled by Margaret that she felt compelled to leave the residence. Fitzwilliam himself also wished for her departure, stating that she troubles my mind somehow. Margaret's son Geoffrey, the instigator of all this, received a pardon. Margaret, conversely, once again forfeited all her lands and her title. The king bestowed her estate upon his personal secretary, Sir Thomas Wriothesley. Margaret was back where she started. But what evidence did they possess of Margaret's guilt? Thomas Cromwell, the king's infamous right-hand man, claimed evidence that Margaret did not support the Church of England. He asserted they had discovered a tunic embroidered with the 5 wounds of Christ. Surely this demonstrated her continued support for the Catholic Church. However, there might have been an entirely different explanation behind it all. Thomas Cromwell wasn't always scrupulous, and he might have betrayed Margaret in the most egregious manner. It was highly probable that he hadn't actually found the tunic among Margaret's possessions. It could be that he planted it there solely to incriminate her. Regardless, the situation looked bleak for Margaret. Margaret Pole had experienced fluctuating favor and disfavor with the king for many years, and now it appeared he had reached his limit. He administered the most severe punishment imaginable: execution. It seemed like the conclusion of Margaret's life, yet it was not quite time. To await her execution, Margaret was sent to the Tower of London. Waiting for execution is nobody's idea of enjoyment, but Margaret experienced some benefits. She encountered her grandson Henry there. There is also proof that life within the tower wasn't entirely harsh. Perhaps King Henry felt remorse for sending Margaret to the tower, as he paid a substantial sum to ensure her comfort. In addition to attendance and funds, he also provided her with warm clothing and footwear. She even had an opportunity for some ironic satisfaction. The man primarily responsible for Margaret's imprisonment, Thomas Cromwell also fell from the king's favor. While Margaret was appreciating her warm gowns and shoes in the Tower, Cromwell met his unfortunate demise. The king had him executed in 1540, but regrettably, Margaret was next. 2.5 years after arriving at the Tower of London, Margaret, now 67 years old, received a communication. This occurred on May 27, 1541. The message simply stated she had less than an hour remaining. This was the culmination, the end of her life. The Tower employed a chief executioner whose grim duty involved removing individuals' heads professionally. At this particular time, he was occupied handling rebels in the north. To substitute for him, there was a young man lacking the requisite experience for the task. Margaret's destiny rested in his uncertain hands. Margaret Pole was unwilling to accept her fate passively. She refused to place her head on the designated block. She declared that only traitors placed their heads there, and she was no traitor. She even provoked the executioner, stating he would have to attempt to take her head by any means possible. At this juncture, all prospects for Margaret receiving a swift and relatively painless end were extinguished. The combination of Margaret's provocations and the executioner's lack of skill meant the initial blow of the axe struck her shoulder rather than her neck. What transpired next resembled something from a horror movie. Because this young executioner lacked the proficiency to perform the task quickly, Margaret endured immense suffering. Ultimately, it required 11 strikes of the axe to sever Margaret's head from her body. Margaret Pole had sacrificed her life defending the Catholic Church, and her family had also endured hardship. The Catholic Church eventually acknowledged the extent of Margaret's suffering merely for opposing King Henry and his Church of England. In 1886, Pope Leo XIII declared her Blessed Margaret Pole a martyr for the Church. Margaret Pole's life was marked by both immense privilege and devastating loss. Born into royalty, she lived through the violent dissolution of her family, the execution of her father, the imprisonment and death of her brother, and decades of political instability. Despite these personal tragedies, Margaret displayed extraordinary resilience, rebuilding her life through loyalty to the crown, wise political alliances, and maternal devotion. Her rise to the title of Countess of Salisbury and her trusted position at court testified to her strength and intelligence. Yet these very qualities may have also fueled suspicion and envy in a monarch known for his paranoia and ruthlessness. Her son Reginald's outspoken opposition to King Henry VIII's break from Rome placed the entire Pole family under a shadow of danger. Though Margaret tried to distance herself from her son's actions, the king's wrath was unrelenting. The dubious evidence presented against her, such as the embroidered tunic, symbolized how flimsy pretexts could justify royal vengeance in a time when dissent, real or perceived, meant death. Thanks for watching History Exposed. If you enjoy uncovering history's best stories, hit like and subscribe to continue exploring with us.